I think many of us wonder about what it's like to work with such historic leaders like you did. So I want to get your perspective on a few of these leaders and just a brief idea of what each one was to work with. So I'll go down a short list. Let's start with Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko. What kind of person was he, and how did the two of you get along together?
Gromyko was smart and very experienced. He'd been in that job a long time. But I always felt I had an advantage over him because he never lived in his own country. You know, he was posted abroad huge times. And when he was in Moscow, they lived in little cocoons. Their wives shopped at special stores. So they didn't really have much of an idea of what their country was really like. But he was very able, and he had a point of view, but you have to remember that we went through with him the deployment of missiles, the big tension, finally easing of it, and then he was invited to Washington in 1984, and then he and I had a negotiation in Geneva that restarted the arms control talks. So all of this in a sense laid the groundwork for everything that came later. That was all before Gorbachev. So Gromyko was somebody you could work with.
Helmut Kohl of Germany. What was he like as a person to work with?
Well, he was courageous. He's the one who sold the deployment of Pershing missiles, and he had huge opposition. They thought it was his finest hour. But he was a good, steady ally. We had one odd problem with him, and I don't understand it to this day. But one time he was in Washington, and we're in the Oval Office, the president, Helmut Kohl, and me, with an interpreter. And Helmut says, "Mr. President, I went to a cemetery where French and German soldiers were buried with President Mitterrand of France. We had a handshake, and it was all over the place, and it helped our relationships. And President Reagan was scheduled to come to Germany, I think, 4 or 5 months later. So would you come to a cemetery where U.S. and German soldiers are buried? Will you do the same thing?" So Reagan agreed. So then they selected a cemetery named Bitburg. And somebody apparently did a sloppy job, and we accepted it. Then the press dusted off the gravestones, and it turned out the SS were buried there. So it was a huge hue and cry. The president couldn't go to such a cemetery. And Elie Wiesel, the Holocaust survivor, came to the White House and said, "Mr. President, your place is with the victims of the SS, not with the SS." It was very dramatic. And the Germans wouldn't change. We suggested all kinds of places. They wouldn't change.
They wouldn't change.
And why, I never could quite understand it. My friend Helmut Schmidt, who had been a predecessor of Kohl's, and was my friend, he was finance minister when I was secretary of the Treasury. We became good friends. He came over, and he said, "You got to go to a Holocaust camp." We had already figured that out. Mm-hmm. But you have to go. I couldn't figure out why. But in the end, he went. And afterwards, he went back to Washington. I went to Israel to speak at the dedication of the outdoor Yad Vashem. Mm-hmm. And I went back by London, and I had a meeting with Margaret Thatcher. Mm-hmm. And Margaret said to me, "There is no other leader in the free world who would have taken the beating at home that Ronald Reagan took in order to deliver on a promise." Mm-hmm. But if there's one thing you know about Ronald Reagan is, if he gives you his word, he's good for it.
Wow.
And I think any good leader has to do the things that he says he's going to do. Mm-hmm. So he's trusted. If you agree to do something and you don't do it, I'm not going to deal with you next time. How do I deal with you? Mm-hmm. I don't know how to deal with you because you can't be trusted. Mm-hmm. So Reagan, one of the reasons why he was such a good leader is he was trusted.
He was trusted. Mm-hmm. What about Soviet leader Gorbachev? What was he like?
After I left office, he came here somewhat to visit me. And he said one of the things he'd like to do is have a kind of a seminar with some of the big intellects around here.
Mm-hmm.
So I organized it. You practically had to be a Nobel laureate to make the cut. You had biologists, chemists, physicists, mathematicians, economists, and so on. And I rehearsed them the day before. I said, you got to figure out something to say in your field that is substantive, but you can say in about 4 minutes. So, and one of the guys was an earthquake scientist. And he called me and he said, there was an earthquake in San Francisco of such and such a magnitude. And some of the older buildings had a problem, but most everything held up pretty well. But there was the same size earthquake in Armenia and everything fell down.
Mm-hmm.
So I said, why don't you just say the first part and see what happens? Anyway, we go around the room. And Gorbachev responded with content to each of these statements, each scientist. He had no idea ahead of time who they were, what they were going to say. So the brilliance of his mind was on display. So the earthquake guy says just the first word about San Francisco. And Gorbachev says, without a minute's hesitation, we had an earthquake in Armenia about the same time and everything fell down. He said, you have good engineers, we have good engineers. But our problem is we can't get people to build things according to the engineering specifications.
Mm-hmm.
It's quite a telling comment. But he was a brilliant guy who was fun to deal with. And I remember the first time we met with him in Kremlin at the time of the Chernenko funeral. When we got through, I said to our people, this is not like any Soviet leader we've ever dealt with before. He's quicker, his mind ranges farther, and he'll be tough to deal with because he's so agile. But there's one thing about him that's different. You can have a conversation with him. He listens to what you say and he answers it. And he expects you to listen to what he says and answer. It's a real conversation. Mm-hmm. It's not a conversation if you and I are sitting opposite each other and you say something and it goes by my ear and your ear. That's not a conversation. That's just two people talking.
Mm-hmm.
So he was courageous and smart and contributed a lot. And I consider him a friend. We still keep in touch.
Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping.
He was brilliant, direct. You didn't have to scratch your head about what he meant. He told you exactly what was on his mind. And from what I can see, he did a brilliant job with China.
Right. Margaret Thatcher, who you mentioned earlier.
Oh, she was a fantastic person. She's an example of a strong leader who could set a strategy, and in the tough tactical times in implementing that strategy, she'd stick with it. Mm-hmm. And she was a good partner with President Reagan and me, and we kept each other, particularly in the Soviet Union and developments, when we'd go there and compare notes and so on. So she was a good partner, and she was fun. Mm-hmm. We had the last state visitor in the Reagan period was Margaret Thatcher, deliberately. And at noontime, when these things take place, the Secretary of State gets to give a luncheon for her. Mm-hmm. So I gave a luncheon for Margaret. And had a great guest list. But somebody brought me up a toast. Usually I give a toast, then she gives a toast. And I got one of these toasts about her 2 quarters a day. And I said, I don't want that. So, she always carried a little purse around, mm-hmm. handbag. So I got a girl in my office to go out and shop around and find a handbag like that. Then I got some of these, she had these really nifty little statements she would make about some subject. And I got a bunch of cards with these statements and I put them in the handbag. So my toast was, and I said, Margaret, I am now going to award you something very special, the Grand Order of the Handbag. So here's the handbag. And I said, I know you're never supposed to look in a lady's handbag, let alone Margaret Thatcher's,
Uh-huh.
but I'm going to look and see what's in it. And I pulled out these quotes and I read them out. She loved it.
And that was your toast. Two more. Hosni Mubarak of Egypt.
I always thought he was a strong, courageous person. He had his weaknesses, but he maintained the Camp David Accords that basically were the derivative of Sadat.
Mm-hmm.
He was in that sense a friend.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought he was not handled right with this.
With the Arab Spring.
What they should have done is what we did with Marcos in the Philippines. He got to the point where he couldn't govern. So we went and we said, you cannot govern. So we'll take you out of here to a decent place so you can live a life. So we got a big airplane over there in Clarkfield, put anything on it you want, put your family on it, and we flew him to Hawaii, the place we had there. I think we should have done that with Mubarak.
With Mubarak.
Just take him, instead of having him humiliated and put in jail and all this stuff, get him out of there and be done with it.
Mm-hmm. And then finally, Menachem Begin of Israel.
I didn't know Begin that well because
Mm-hmm.
he disappeared. I knew Shamir more than I did Begin.
Okay.
But Begin was a tough guy. But the big thing about him was if he agreed with you on something, he would keep his word. He could deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
With Shamir, I had one of the most nicest things that ever happened.
Mm-hmm.
We were working with King Hussein, hoping to bring about a relationship between Israel and Jordan.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought we were getting somewhere. But King Hussein kept insisting that he had to have an international umbrella under which to negotiate.
Mm-hmm.
So we had the idea, well, there's the upcoming summit meeting in Washington between Gorbachev and Reagan would be a great umbrella.
Mm-hmm.
So I pitched that out to President Reagan. And he said, okay, but first you got to go to Israel. If they say okay, then you got to go to King Hussein. If he says okay, then you got to go to Gorbachev. He says okay, then we can do it.
Mm-hmm.
So I go to Israel. At that time they had a bifurcated government. Perez was foreign minister. Shamir was prime minister. So I go to Perez. And he says, I agree, but I won't say anything, because if I say yes, Shamir will say no. So, but you know you've got me in your pocket, I'll be quiet.
Mm-hmm.
So I go to Shamir, and he says he'd consider it. And the next day, when we agreed the following evening, we'd meet. And the next day I was off at the Weizmann Institute all day long. The staffs talked. And it had been arranged that Shamir and I would have a private dinner, talk about Soviet Jewry, and after that, he would give his answer. So I'm getting ready to go over to the dinner, and my people say, we're either going to have a long night or a short night. I said, what do you mean? He says, well, if he says no, it's a short night. If he says yes, then we're going to be up all night negotiating side letters and MOUs and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
I said, well, okay. So we go have a nice dinner, and then we come, and it comes time for Shamir to speak, and he sort of picks himself up, and he says, Mr. Secretary, you know our dreams. You know our nightmares. We trust you. Go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
That was it.
That was it.
So trust is the coin of the realm in so many of these dealings.
Okay.
And if you don't have it, you have a hard time getting anything done.
Okay.
If you do have it, you can do a lot.